Hi, I'm coming to you from my home library today because I want to talk to you about a genre book called classics. Classics are, there's different definitions depending on who you talk to, but in our library, it's generally books that were written at least 20 years ago, some of them much, much longer ago than that. So I wanted to show you that I have a lot of books here that were actually some of my favorite books when I was your age and younger, and books also on the shelf that I bought later and read to my kids. But some of these books are quite old and still good. So the thing about classics that you have to remember is that because they were written a long time ago, sometimes they include either language or attitudes that are not, they never were okay, and they're definitely considered much less acceptable today than they were when they were written. But in some cases, these books have a lot of cultural value, which means they help us understand the way things used to be. And now that we know better, we can write better books. And so sometimes it's really interesting to read older books to kind of see that juxtaposition and the change, and hopefully positive change, and where we can continue to change and do better. The book that I wanted to show you today, though, I feel like is not super outdated. I feel like it's still pretty relevant today. It is probably the book that was my favorite when I was your age, and I can prove it. I have this book, A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle, and first of all, this book cost $1.25 according to the cover. And when I opened it today and I was looking at it to see if I wanted to read to you, I noticed that, I don't know how well you can see this, but on the inside cover, I made some notes when I was in seventh grade, and it says my name and my phone number, and then it says 1982 to 83. My homeroom was room 201. So I don't really remember who my homeroom teacher was when I was in seventh grade, but room 201 is down where I believe it's one of the rooms where Arches is now, and I think it used to be one of the either French or Spanish room when I was a student here. So that's kind of fun to look back. Um, Also, I noticed, I don't know if you can tell, see how that there's tape on it because the cover ripped off, and that's okay. Like that just happens. It's a well-loved book. I read this one a lot. But see how it's kind of yellowed there? That's because I used regular tape to tape up this book instead of special book tape. So for your own future reference, that yellow discoloration is what happens when you use regular like Scotch tape. So if you ever find that a library book or even a book that you have is ruined, or not ruined, but like needs some repair, bring it to me. I have special tape to fix it up. Okay, A Wrinkle in Time. And the first chapter is called Mrs. Whatsit. It was a dark and stormy night. In her attic bedroom, Margaret Murray. So, the reason why I love this book so much is because I really identified with the main character, Meg Murray. She was like a very kind of smart, but very awkward um, sort of pre-teenager at the time, and I was also very awkward at the time, and she didn't have a lot of self-confidence, at least in the beginning of the book, and she didn't really trust herself and her instincts. And then over the course of the book, she learns about herself, and she starts kind of gaining confidence. And to me, that was super appealing at that age, because I just felt like, it's just it's a time in your life when you're really learning your own identity and learning your own self-confidence. And I just really loved her character. Chapter 1, Mrs. Whatsit. It was a dark and stormy night. In her attic bedroom, Margaret Murray, wrapped in an old patchwork quilt, sat on the foot of her bed and watched the trees tossing in the frenzied lashing of the wind. Behind the trees, clouds scudded frantically across the sky. Every few moments, the moon ripped through them, creating wraith-like shadows that raced along the ground. The house shook. Wrapped in her quilt, Meg shook. She wasn't usually afraid of the weather. It's not just the weather, she thought. It's the weather on top of everything else. On top of me. On top of Meg Murray doing everything wrong. School. School was all wrong. She'd been dropped down to the lowest section in her grade. That morning, one of her teachers had said crossly, "Really, Meg, I don't understand how a child with parents as brilliant as yours are supposed to be can be such a poor student. If you don't manage to do a little better, you'll have to stay back next year. During lunch, she'd roughhoused it a little to try to make herself feel better, and one of the girls had said scornfully, "After all, Meg, we aren't in grammar school kids anymore. Why do you always act like such a baby?" And on the way home from school, walking up the road with her arms full of books, one of the boys had said something about her dumb baby brother. At this, she'd thrown the books to the side of the road and tackled him with every ounce of strength she had, and arrived at home with her blouse torn and a big bruise under one eye. Sandy and Dennis, her 10-year-old twin brothers, who got home from school an hour earlier than she did, were disgusted. "Let us do the fighting when it's necessary," they told her. "A delinquent, that's what I am," she thought grimly. "That's what they'll be saying next. Not mother, but them. Everybody else. I wish father—" But it was still not possible to think about her father without the danger of tears. Only her mother could talk about him in a natural way, saying, "When your father gets back." Gets back from where? And when? Surely her mother must know what people were saying, must be aware of the smugly vicious gossip. Surely it must hurt her as it did Meg. But if it did, she gave no outward sign. Nothing ruffled the serenity of her expression. "Why can't I hide it too?" Meg thought. "Why do I always have to show everything?" The window rattled madly in the wind, and she pulled the quilt close about her. Curled up on one of her pillows, a gray fluff of kitten yawned, showing its pink tongue, tucked its head under again, and went back to sleep. Everybody was asleep. Everybody except Meg. Even Charles Wallace, the dumb baby brother, who had an uncanny way of knowing when she was awake and unhappy, and who would come so many nights, tiptoeing up the attic stairs to her. Even Charles Wallace was asleep. How could they sleep? All day on the radio there'd been hurricane warnings. How could they leave her up in the attic in the rickety brass bed, knowing that the roof might be blown right off the house, and she tossed out into the wild night sky to land who knows where? Her shivering grew uncontrollable. "You asked to have the attic bedroom," she told herself savagely. "Mother let you have it because you're the oldest. It's a privilege, not a punishment." "Not during a hurricane, it's not a privilege," she said aloud. She tossed the quilt down on the foot of the bed and stood up. The kitten stretched luxuriously and looked up at her with huge, innocent eyes. "Go back to sleep," Meg said. "Just be glad you're a kitten and not a monster like me." She looked at herself in the wardrobe mirror and made a horrible face, bearing a mouthful of teeth covered in braces. Automatically, she pushed her glasses into position, ran her fingers through her mouse-brown hair so that it stood wildly on end, and let out a sigh almost as noisy as the wind. The wide wooden floorboards were cold against her feet. Wind blew in the crevices around the window frame, in spite of the protection the storm sash was supposed to offer. She could hear wind howling in the chimneys. From all the way downstairs, she could hear Fortinbras, the big black dog, starting to bark. He must be frightened too. What was he barking at? Fortinbras never barked without reason. Suddenly, she remembered that when she had gone to the post office to pick up the mail, she'd heard about a tramp who was supposed to have stolen 12 sheets from Mrs. Buncombe, the constable's wife. They hadn't caught him, and maybe he was heading for the Murray's house right now, isolated on a back road as it was. And this time, maybe he'd go after more than sheets. Meg hadn't paid much attention to the talk about the tramp at the time, because the postmistress, with a sugary smile, had asked if she'd heard from her father lately. She left her little room and made her way through the shadows of the main attic, bumping against the ping-pong table. Great, now I'll have a bruise on my hip on top of everything else, she thought. Next, she walked into her old doll's house, Charles Wallace's rocking horse, and the twins' electric trains. "Why must everything happen to me?" she demanded of a huge teddy bear. At the foot of the attic stairs, she stood still and listened. Not a sound from Charles Wallace's room on the right. On the left, in her parents' room, not a rustle from her mother sleeping alone in the great double bed. She tiptoed down the hall and into the twins' room, pushing again at her glasses as though they could help her see better in the dark. Dennis was snoring. Sandy murmured something about baseball and subsided. The twins didn't have any problems. They weren't great students, but they weren't bad ones either. They were perfectly content with a succession of B's and an occasional A or C. They were strong, fast runners and good at games, and when cracks were made about anybody in the Murray family, they weren't made about Sandy or Dennis. She left the twins' room and went on downstairs, avoiding the creaking seventh step. Fortinbras had stopped barking. It wasn't the tramp this time, then. Fort would go on barking if anybody was around. But suppose the tramp does come. Suppose he has a knife. Nobody lives near enough to hear if we screamed and screamed and screamed. Nobody'd care anyhow. I'll make some cocoa, she decided. That'll cheer me up. And if the roof blows off, at least I won't go off with it. In the kitchen, a light was already on, and Charles Wallace was sitting at the table, drinking milk and eating bread and jam. He looked very small and vulnerable sitting there in the big old-fashioned kitchen, a blond little boy in faded blue Dr. Denton's, his feet swinging a good 6 inches above the floor. "Hi," he said cheerfully. "I've been waiting for you." I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here because it's a pretty long first chapter because I want to get to the good stuff at the end. As Charles Wallace gave Meg her sandwich, Fortinbras came out from under the table. He gave a long, low growl, and they could see the dark fur slowly rising on his back. Meg felt her own skin prickle. "What's wrong?" she asked anxiously. Fortinbras stared at the door that opened into Mrs. Murray's laboratory, which was in the old stone dairy right off the kitchen. Beyond the lab, a pantry led outdoors, though Mrs. Murray had done her best to train the family to come into the house through the garage door or the front door and not through her lab. But it was the lab door and not the garage door toward which Fortinbras was growling. "You didn't leave any nasty-smelling chemicals cooking over a Bunsen burner, did you, Mother?" Charles Wallace asked. Mrs. Murray stood up. "No, but I think I better go see what's upsetting Fort anyhow." "It's the tramp. I'm sure it's the tramp," Meg said nervously. "What tramp?" Charles Wallace asked. "They were saying at the post office this afternoon that a tramp stole all Mrs. Buncombe's sheets." "We'd better sit on the pillowcases then," Mrs. Murray said lightly. "I don't think even a tramp would be out in a night like this, Meg." "But that's probably why he is out," Meg wailed, "trying to find a place not to be out." "In which case, I'll offer him the barn till morning." Mrs. Murray went briskly to the door. "I'll go with you." Meg's voice was shrill. "No, Meg, you stay with Charles and eat your sandwich." "Eat!" Meg exclaimed as Mrs. Murray went out through the lab. "How does she expect me to eat?" After a few moments that seemed like forever to Meg, Mrs. Murray came back in, holding the door open for, was it the tramp? It seemed small for Meg's idea of a tramp. The age or sex was impossible to tell, for it was completely bundled up in clothes. Several scarves of assorted colors were tied about the head, and a man's felt hat perched atop. A shocking pink stole was knotted about a rough overcoat, and black rubber boots covered the feet. "Mrs. Whatsit?" Charles said suspiciously. "What are you doing here, and at this time of night, too?" "Now, don't you be worried, my honey," a voice emerged from among the turned-up collar, stole, scarves, and hat, a voice like an unoiled gate, but somehow not unpleasant. "Mrs. Whatsit says she lost her way," Mrs. Murray said. "Would you care for some hot chocolate, Mrs. Whatsit?" "Charmed, I'm sure," Mrs. Whatsit answered, taking off the hat and the stole. "It isn't so much that I lost my way as that I got blown off course, and when I realized that I was at little Charles Wallace's house, I thought I'd just come in and rest a bit before proceeding on my way." "How did you know this was Charles Wallace's house?" Meg asked. "By the smell." Mrs. Whatsit untied a blue and green paisley scarf, a red and yellow flowered print, a gold Liberty print, a red and black bandana. Under all this, a sparse quantity of grayish hair was tied in a small but tidy knot on top of her head. Her eyes were bright, her nose was round, a round soft blob, her mouth puckered like an autumn apple. "My, but it's lovely and warm in here," she said. "Do sit down," Mrs. Murray indicated a chair. "Would you like a sandwich, Mrs. Whatsit? I've had liverwurst and cream cheese. Charles has bread and jam, and Meg lettuce and tomato." "Now, let me see," Mrs. Whatsit pondered. "I'm passionately fond of Russian caviar." "You peaked," Charles cried indignantly. "We're saving that for Mother's birthday, and you can't have any." Mrs. Whatsit gave a deep and pathetic sigh. No, Charles said. Now you mustn't give it in to her, Mother, or I shall be very angry. How about tuna fish salad? All right, Mrs. Whatsit said meekly. I'll fix it, Meg offered, going to the pantry for a can of tuna fish. For crying out loud, she thought. This old woman comes barging in on us in the middle of the night, and Mother takes it as though there weren't anything peculiar about it at all? I bet she is the tramp. I bet she did steal those sheets, and she's certainly no one Charles Wallace ought to be friends with, especially when he won't even talk to ordinary people. I've only been in the neighborhood a short time, Mrs. Whatsit was saying, as Meg switched off the pantry light and came back into the kitchen with the tuna fish. And I didn't think I was going to like the neighbors at all until dear little Charles came over with his dog. Mrs. Whatsit, Charles Wallace demanded severely, why did you take Mrs. Buncombe's sheets? Well, I needed them, Charles dear. You must return them at once. But Charles, dear, I can't. I've used them. That was very wrong of you, Charles Wallace scolded. If you needed sheets that badly, you could have asked me. Mrs. Whatsit shook her head and clucked. You can't spare any sheets. Mrs. Buncombe can. Meg cut up some celery and mixed it in with the tuna. After a moment's hesitation, she opened the refrigerator door and brought out a little jar of sweet little pickles. Though why I'm doing it for her, I don't know, she thought. As she cut them up, I don't trust her one bit. Tell your sister I'm all right, Mrs. Whatsit said to Charles. Tell her my intentions are good. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, Charles intoned. My, but isn't he cunning? Mrs. Whatsit beamed at him fondly. It's lucky he has someone to understand him. But I'm afraid he doesn't, Mrs. Murray said. None of us is quite up to Charles. But at least you aren't trying to squash him down, Mrs. Whatsit nodded her head vigorously. You're letting him be himself. Here's your sandwich, Meg said, bringing it to Mrs. Whatsit. Do you mind if I take off my boots before I eat? Mrs. Whatsit asked, picking up the sandwich nevertheless. Listen. She moved her feet up and down in her boots, and they could hear water squelching. My toes are ever so damp. The trouble is that these boots are a mite too tight for me, and I never can take them off by myself. I'll help you, Charles offered. Not you. You're not strong enough. I'll help. Mrs. Murray squatted at Mrs. Whatsit's feet, yanking on one slick boot. When the boot came off, it came off suddenly. Mrs. Murray sat down with a thump. Mrs. Whatsit went tumbling backward with the chair onto the floor, sandwich held high in one old claw. Water poured out of the boot and ran over the floor and the big braided rug. Oh, dearie me, Mrs. Whatsit said, lying on her back in the overturned chair, her feet in the air, one in a red and white striped sock and the other still booted. Mrs. Murray got to her feet. Are you all right, Mrs. Whatsit? If you have some liniment, I'll put it on my dignity, Mrs. Whatsit said, still supine. I think it's sprained. A little oil of cloves, mixed well with garlic, is rather good. And she took a large bite of sandwich. Do please get up, Charles said. I don't like to see you lying there that way. You're carrying things too far. Have you ever tried to get to your feet with a sprained dignity? But Mrs. Whatsit scrambled up, righted the chair, and then sat back down on the floor. The booted foot stuck straight out in front of her and took another bite. She moved with great agility for such an old woman, and a very old woman at that. Mrs. Whatsit, her mouth full, ordered Mrs. Murray, Now pull while I'm already down. Quite calmly, as though this old woman and her boots were nothing out of the ordinary, Mrs. Murray pulled until the second boot relinquished a foot. This foot was covered in a blue and gray argyle sock, and Mrs. Whatsit sat there wriggling her toes, contentedly finishing her sandwich before scrambling to her feet. Ah, she said, that's ever so much better. And she took both boots and shook them out over the sink. My stomach is full, and I'm warm inside and out, and it's time I went home. Don't you think you'd better stay till morning? Mrs. Murray asked. Oh, thank you, dearie, but there's so much to do, I just can't waste time sitting around frivoling. It's much too wild a night to travel in. Wild nights are my glory, Mrs. Whatsit said. I just got caught in a downdraft and blown off course. Well, at least until your socks are dry. Wet socks don't bother me. I just didn't like the water swishing around in my boots. Now, don't worry about me, Lamb." Lamb was not a word one would ordinarily think of calling Mrs. Murray. "I shall just sit down for a moment and pop my boots on, and then I'll be on my way. Speaking of ways, Pet, by the way, there is such thing as a tesseract." Mrs. Murray went very white and with one hand reached backward and clutched at a chair for support. Her voice trembled. "What did you say?" Mrs. Whatsit tugged on her second boot. "I said," she grunted, shoving her foot down, "that there is, shove, such a thing, shove, as a tesseract." Her foot went down into the boot, and grabbing shawls, scarves, and hats, she hustled out the door. Mrs. Murray stayed very still, making no move to help the old woman. As the door opened, Fortinbras streaked in, panting, wet, and shiny as a seal. He looked at Mrs. Murray and whined. The door slammed. "Mother, what's the matter?" Meg cried. "What did she say? What is it?" "The tesseract," Mrs. Murray whispered. What did she mean? How could she have known? How could she have known? She